ballroom didn't go quiet all at once. It happened the way a fire goes out, from the edges inward, table by table, conversation by conversation, until the only sound was the measured scrape of Zane Calder's shoes on the marble floor as he crossed the room. Not toward the gallery director, not toward the senator standing near the champagne fountain. Toward Harlow. The woman in the borrowed black shift dress with paint thinner, still faintly embedded under her cuticles and a museum badge hanging from a lanyard she'd tucked into her neckline so it wouldn't catch on things. That was the moment Priscilla Adair's smile finally ran out of somewhere to go. Harlow Greer had been contracted to monitor the Meridian House collection for exactly one reason. Nobody else in Chicago had her eye for climate distress signals in pre-impressionist oils. The Blackwood Foundation's annual winter gala drew 400 donors, 3 network cameras, and roughly $12 million in loan paintings that couldn't be in the same room as an open bar without someone who knew what they were doing, keeping watch over the humidity sensors. That someone was Harlow. She'd arrived at 4 in the afternoon, 3 hours before the first guest. She walked each panel in the East Gallery, checked the environmental monitors, made notes in the margin of her intake form, and then stationed herself in the most inconspicuous corner she could find near the Monet that was making her quietly nervous. An 1874 shore scene with a hairline crack in the lower left quadrant that the Foundation's shipping company had not disclosed in the condition report. She'd emailed Director Roth about it. He'd acknowledged it. He had not done anything about it. She was used to that. The dress was borrowed from her friend Carissa, who was a size larger and 4 inches taller, which meant the hem fell correctly, but the shoulders sat a little wide. Harlow had pinned them from the inside. She'd left her hair down because there hadn't been time to do anything with it. She looked, in aggregate, like a woman who worked hard and occasionally cleaned up, and had stopped apologizing for the difference between the two. Her brother Connor's next infusion cycle was in 19 days. The multiple sclerosis had progressed faster than the first neurologist had predicted, and the new treatment protocol was working. His last markers had come back trending down for the first time in a year. But the gap between what the insurance covered and what the actual billing statement said was a number Harlow knew by heart, the way people know the combination to a lock they open every single day. This contract covered it. That was the only math she was doing tonight. The gala filled up fast. Chicago money moved differently than New York money, louder, more proprietary about the art on its walls, quicker to corner the catering staff with opinions. Harlow made herself sit in small kneel and kept her clipboard close. She knew how to be invisible in rooms like this. She'd been doing it for 7 years. You kept your eyes moving, your posture neutral, your badge angled so the name showed without being obvious. You became a feature of the room rather than a person in it. It was, she had found, the most efficient way to get the work done without being interrupted by people asking what that painting was worth. She was rechecking the sensor reading on the Monet when she heard the laugh. It wasn't a laugh she recognized immediately with her brain. Her stomach recognized it first. A cold contraction, the kind a body produces when it remembers something the mind has worked to put away. She looked up. Priscilla Adair was standing 20 feet away in a column of champagne-colored satin, her copper hair swept into the kind of updo that took a professional 90 minutes and 3 rounds of consultation. She was surrounded by 3 women who had the particular quality of people who'd been invited as accessories rather than guests, and she was laughing at something the man beside her had said, a man Harlow vaguely clocked as a junior partner at something financial, and the laugh was exactly the same as it had always been. Controlled, carrying, built to be heard across a room. Priscilla Adair had been 2 years ahead of Harlow at the Chicago Art Institute's conservation program. She hadn't finished the program. She hadn't needed to. Her father had purchased her a gallery in River North as a gift for her 24th birthday, and now she was Priscilla Adair of Adair Fine Art, whose name appeared in the Tribune twice a year and whose opinion on emerging acquisition trends was taken seriously by people who didn't know enough to question it. Harlow had stayed in the program, had graduated, had built a freelance practice one contract at a time, the slow, unglamorous kind of career built on reputation and word of mouth, and the willingness to take the call at 11:30 on a Wednesday night when someone had a problem that needed solving before dawn. She turned back to the Monet. Don't engage. Check the sensor, log the reading, keep moving. Is that Harlow Greer? The voice carried exactly as much as it needed to. Harlow closed her eyes for half a second, then she turned around. Priscilla was watching her with the expression of someone who has found something both amusing and disappointing in equal measure. I thought that was you. Her gaze traveled the length of the borrowed dress, paused at the badge lanyard, came back up to Harlow's face. I didn't realize you were working the event. I'm contracted with the foundation, Harlow said. Her voice stayed even. She'd had years of practice keeping it even. Environmental monitoring for the loan collection. Oh, Priscilla's mouth made a small, sympathetic shape, like a maintenance technician. One of the accessory women laughed softly. The junior partner swirled his scotch. Conservation consultant, Harlow said. The Monet in the East Wing has a stress fracture the shipping report didn't catch. Someone needs to watch it. Of course. Priscilla stepped slightly closer, the movement casual, the effect not. You always did prefer the pieces other people had already moved past. A pause that ran a beat too long to be accidental. I was just telling Director Roth about you, actually. He was asking about the Flemish panel attribution question from your third semester. You had that whole theory about the ground composition, do you remember? There was some discussion at the time about the methodology. Harlow's jaw tightened. She knew exactly what Priscilla was doing. The attribution question from third semester hadn't been a question. It had been a practical examination. Harlow had correctly identified a workshop copy. Her professor had agreed with the analysis and given her the highest mark in the section. Priscilla had not been in the class. She had no first-hand knowledge of what had occurred. She was building a story from second-hand gossip and her own imagination, and counting on the fact that no one in this circle would bother to verify it. I don't remember any problem with that assessment, Harlow said carefully. Well, Priscilla touched her collarbone lightly, the gesture of someone remembering something they wish they could forget on your behalf. I just heard there was some discussion. I'm sure it all sorted itself out. She looked past Harlow to Director Aldous Roth, who had drifted into their orbit with the taut, alert interest of a man who catastrophizes quietly about institutional reputation and had begun doing so. Aldous, you know Harlow from her earlier contract work. She's been building a practice for, what is it now, 7 years? Roth's eyes moved to Harlow's badge, to the clipboard. Miss Greer, he said without warmth, I wasn't aware you had a prior relationship with the Foundation beyond this engagement. I was referred by the Hendricks Museum, Harlow said. I completed their last 3 seasonal assessments. I can provide documentation. It wasn't quite a word. It was the sound people make when they've already made up their mind, and a buying time to phrase it diplomatically. I do think we should revisit the contract arrangement, given the scope of what's on loan tonight. We need someone with a more senior profile on the monitoring. I'm sure you understand. Harlow's fingers went white around the clipboard. More senior. She was 28 years old and had 7 years of field experience, and had identified 3 forgeries that had cleared major auction houses undetected. She had published. She had published in journals that the people in this room had never heard of and would not have been able to name if asked. She knew things about the Manet 30 feet behind her that the people who owned it did not know. But she also knew that if Roth pulled her contract tonight, the agency would hear about it by morning. The agency controlled half her income pipeline. Connor's infusion was in 19 days. I can provide full credentials and letters of recommendation, she said steady. Whatever would be helpful. Ruth began. I don't. The voice came from behind her, and the room responded before she had turned around. Not with a gasp or a visible flinch, just a reorientation, subtle and immediate, the way every conversation in a 20-foot radius quietly reprioritized itself. Harlow turned. Zane Calder was not the tallest man in the room or the one with the most obvious physical presence. He was somewhere in his late 30s, dark hair going silver at the temples, with the quality of stillness that accumulates in people who have spent years in rooms where every word has a price. Dark suit, white shirt open at the collar, no tie. He was walking toward them with the unhurried precision of someone who had decided on a direction and found the concept of being redirected genuinely uninteresting. Harlow had met him exactly once. A warehouse in the West Loop, 11:30 on a Wednesday night, November. He'd called the emergency line for independent assessors because a painting was going to insurance appraisal at 8 the next morning, and something had started to feel wrong in the way that important things do just before they go catastrophically sideways. She'd spent 4 hours with a penlight, a pocket spectroscope, and a reference database on her phone. She'd found it, a Modigliani, supposedly from 1919, with a Craiglour pattern inconsistent with the canvas aging, a ground layer that UV showed in the wrong color temperature, and a provenance gap of 9 years papered over with a gallery receipt that didn't survive 20 minutes of verification. She'd told him it was a fraud. He'd been quiet for a long time. She'd shown him every marker, every discrepancy, methodically, without softening it until he sat down on a packing crate with his hands clasped and looked at the floor. "You're certain," he'd said. "Yes," she'd said. He'd paid her double her rate, given her a card with just his name and a number. Said, "If you ever need anything." She'd said thank you and driven home at 3 in the morning with the heat broken in her car and Connor's night nurse still on the clock and her mind already on the next job. That had been 6 months ago. Zane stopped a few feet from their small circle. He looked at Director Roth. He did not look at Priscilla. "This woman identified a forged Modigliani in my private collection 6 months ago," he said. His voice was quiet, and it carried anyway. The painting had passed through 3 auction houses and 2 independent appraisers before it came to me. She caught what all of them missed. She did it in 4 hours with a penlight and a pocket spectroscope. He paused. "I'd genuinely like to know what qualifies either of you to question her presence here." Roth opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Priscilla said, "I didn't realize you had any connection to." He turned and looked at her, not with anger, with something quieter than anger and more permanent, the polite disinterest of someone who has fully assessed a situation and found it not worth further engagement. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he said. The color that left Priscilla Adair's face left quickly and all at once. Zane turned back to Harlow. He extended his hand, palm up, open. Not a handshake. Something older than that, more deliberate. The kind of gesture that means exactly one thing and cannot be misread. Harlow looked at it. She understood what it was. She understood the weight of it, accepted in front of the people who had just watched a woman try to dismantle her standing in this room piece by careful piece. She placed her hand in his. He raised it, pressed his mouth to her knuckles, not a brush, not a formality, unhurried. His eyes were down. The room was completely still. The collective inhale from the surrounding guests was nearly inaudible. Nearly. He walked with her to the East Gallery, away from the main floor, to the quieter wing where the Manet hung alone with its invisible fracture. That was unnecessary, Harlow said, when they were out of earshot. The hand? All of it you could have vouched for my credentials without the performance. I did vouch for your credentials. The other part was separate. She stopped in front of the Manet, studied it, not him. The fracture was stable. She made a note on her clipboard. Now every person in that room thinks I have some kind of arrangement with you. Arrangements are for people who need to justify their presence. You don't need to justify yours. You know more about what's on these walls than anyone in that ballroom, including the people who own it. He paused. I've been trying to reach you for 3 months. The agency kept routing my calls. She frowned. Routing them where? Nowhere. Blocking them, I think. They told me you weren't taking private client work. He watched her face process this. I assumed you weren't interested. She hadn't known. She'd noticed the pipeline had slowed, but attributed it to the usual seasonal thinning. The agency controlled enough of her income that she'd never pushed back on their management decisions. She filed that information in the back of her mind to deal with later. In the specific, precise way, she dealt with all the things she couldn't afford to feel until the immediate problem was solved. What kind of position? She said. Head conservator for the Calder collection. Permanent. Full studio space on Michigan Avenue. Salary, health coverage, travel budget for acquisition assessment. Complete autonomy over your methodology and your conclusions. I need someone who will tell me when I'm about to spend $12 million on something that isn't what it claims to be. That requires a specific kind of integrity. You have it. She was quiet, looked at the painting. The shore scene, the fractured lower corner, the colors that had been sitting in this light for 150 years and still knew what they were. I want to see the contract before I say anything, she said. Full language on the autonomy clause. If I assess something as a fraud, I document it, and I say so, regardless of what you paid for it or who sold it to you or what the relationship is with the seller. That doesn't change based on inconvenience. Agreed. And I want the title in writing. Not consultant, not advisor. That's what I offered. I know, I want it in the contract. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but in that direction. Most people don't negotiate with me, he said. Harlow looked back at the painting. Most people don't have to, she said. The gala wound down past 11. Harlow stayed through the environmental stabilization, logging her final readings as the room temperature dropped and the humidity crept back toward baseline now that 400 bodies had finally left. She was finishing her walkthrough of the East Wing when she heard his footsteps. She recognized them now, that unhurried, deliberate quality. Zane stopped a few feet behind her. She kept her eyes on the Flemish landscape in the far corner that had been nagging at her all evening. Something in the varnish aging pattern was wrong. She'd need to run UV analysis to confirm it, but the instinct was already fully formed. "Why did you do it?" she said. Not the credential defense, she meant the hand. He was quiet. She turned to look at him. In the dim gallery light, with the crowds gone and the performance of the evening no longer required, his face was different. Open in a way it hadn't been on the main floor. "Because I wanted to," he said. "Because for 6 months I've been trying to find a legitimate reason to walk back into your orbit, and tonight someone handed me one. I wasn't going to waste it on something small." Harlow turned back to the painting. "I'm not interested in being someone's off-hours project," she said. "The art world has plenty of men who collect things. Paintings, ideas, people. I'm not interested in being any of those." "I know that." His voice was even and not defensive. "That's exactly why I want you running the collection, not standing beside me. At openings, the job is real. What I said about you tonight was true. I'd have said it in any room, under any circumstances, regardless of." He paused. "Anything else?" She studied the Flemish varnish. The aging was wrong. She was certain of it now. 15 years too smooth in the upper right quadrant, which meant a restoration, which meant a disclosure gap in the provenance, which meant someone somewhere had something to explain. Something else to document. Something else to bring to a director who would have to decide whether to hear her. "The contract," she said, "tomorrow." "My office, 8 o'clock. 7:30, she said. "I don't like wasting daylight." She heard something in his exhale that might have been a laugh. 7:30, he said. 5 months later, the Meridian house smelled exactly the same. Champagne and hothouse flowers and the low atmospheric hum of a room full of people performing their own net worth for an audience of mirrors. Harlow Greer walked through the grand double doors and barely noticed any of it. She was thinking about the Van Dyck. The formal announcement of the Calder Collection's donation to the Art Institute was tonight. 3 works from the 17th century Flemish holdings. Harlow had spent 4 months on the authentication alone, 17 pages of condition and provenance documentation on the Van Dyck, 3 consultations with the RKD in the Netherlands, correspondence with a retired professor in Ghent who remembered seeing the piece in a private home in 1971 and could describe it in enough detail to cross-reference against the existing catalogue. The chain of ownership had 2 gaps. She'd closed both of them. She'd done it the slow way, the right way, because that was the only way she knew how to work. The dress was her own, deep green, purchased specifically for tonight, budgeted for deliberately. She had stopped borrowing things. Her hair was up. No clipboard, no lanyard, no badge. She had Connor's most recent lab results saved to her phone because she'd gotten them that morning, and they were good. Markers trending down for the 3rd consecutive month. The treatment working the way the new protocol had promised it would. She had stood in the parking lot of the lab and cried for approximately 4 minutes, and then driven to the dry cleaner to pick up the green dress. Zane was near the entrance, mid-conversation with someone from the Art Institute's board. He saw her and broke off the conversation in a way she was still, 5 months in, not entirely sure how to receive gracefully. She was working on it. He offered his arm. She took it. They moved into the room. The crowd shifted around them the way crowds do around the thing with the most gravitational pull in a space. Harlow had spent her entire career at the margins of rooms like this one, watching that shift happen around other people, learning the room's architecture from its edges. Being inside the center of it was a different physics. She was still calibrating. She saw Priscilla near the bar. Priscilla had seen her first. That was clear from the expression already assembled on her face by the time Harlow's gaze found her. A complicated, compressed arrangement of emotions, doing the work of several things simultaneously. The gallery had been through a difficult few months. A piece Priscilla had sold the previous spring was under independent review. The attribution was being disputed. 3 collectors had quietly pulled their consignment agreements while the process was ongoing. Harlow had had no involvement. The art world was a small and self-correcting ecosystem, and sometimes the things you sold found their way back to you through routes you hadn't anticipated. Harlow looked at Priscilla for 1 full second. No anger, no satisfaction, just the flat, brief recognition you give to something you once spent energy worrying about and no longer do. A crack in a sidewalk, you note it and step over it and keep walking. She looked away. At the front of the room, the Art Institute's director adjusted the microphone. He thanked the foundation, thanked the donors, thanked the Calder Collection for its commitment to public access and scholarly stewardship. The authentication and provenance research for this donation, he said, was completed by Miss Harlow Greer, chief conservator of the Calder collection. Her work represents exactly the kind of rigorous, patient scholarship that makes gifts like this one possible, and that protects the integrity of our permanent holdings for the generations who come after us. The applause was real, not the polite, reflexive kind that fills the silence in ballrooms when something is said, and people aren't quite sure of the appropriate response. Real, the kind that happens when a room full of people who care about a thing hear that the thing was done exactly right. Harlow stood still and let it land. Zane leaned down slightly, his voice low near her ear, better than a rescue. She reached out and took a glass of water from a passing tray, took a slow, even sip. "It's a start," she said. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, there was nothing to calculate. No cost-benefit on what she could afford to feel in a room full of people who hadn't bothered to see her until she gave them no other option. No survival math running underneath, everything else like a second language she'd been forced to learn. She stood there in her own green dress with her name still ringing in the air of a room that was still applauding, and she let herself be exactly where she had earned the right to be.